All right, first things first, could everyone just give me, if I conduct you 1, 2, 3, clap. Just one clap. I need it for my recording for Haegue, for her archives, okay? All right, and 1, 2, excellent. That will sync all of my mic channels. I really appreciate you doing that. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jenna Lyle, and I'm the programs director here at the Arts Club of Chicago, which sits on the traditional homelands of many indigenous tribes, especially the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe. Today, Chicago remains a home for a thriving community of indigenous peoples whom we commit to lifting up in our relations and activities. So tonight is a very special night and a great opportunity to learn about and hear the music of a composer with whom I didn't have a lot of experience before we began this project. Haegue Yang, whose work we currently have on view in our downstairs galleries, has noted that she feels a strong connection with the composer Isang Yun. And when she proposed a concert of his music, we were very excited by that prospect. You will learn a lot more about Isang Yun very shortly from Dr. Ryan Dohoney. But I have a few very quick announcements before we get started. Just like save us, number one, save us so much awkward attention and silence your cell phones. Like now, just go ahead and do it if you haven't already. Just even check, like if you thought that you did, you probably didn't. Okay, great. Excellent. Number two, following Dr. Dohoney's talk, we will take a brief moment to reset the stage, and then Mabel, Kwan, and Chris Wilde will begin their performance, which will last a little bit less than an hour. Am I right about that? A yes? Yeah, thumbs up. Great. I also encourage you, if you haven't already, to take one of Haegue's chronologies of conflated dispersion. This one interlinking the lives through much very subjective editing of Isang Yun, whose music you'll hear tonight, and novelist, playwright, screenwriter, filmmaker, general polymath Marguerite Duras. You can read the bios of our lecturer and our performers on the back of tonight's concert program. And I'm just so happy that you're with us here tonight. So without further ado, please welcome Ryan Dohoney.
Great, thank you, Jenna. Can everybody hear me all right? Great, so thanks for this really terrific invitation to be the opening act for two of my favorite musicians, Chris Wilde and Mabel Kwan. So the music you heard as you entered is a piece called Images by Isang Yun. And it deals basically with one of the main problems of my research, which is how do we hear painting or visual art and see music? And so for a long time, I've been concerned with this idea of the relationship between music and the visual arts, and exactly what's the best way to go about exploring that relationship. So, for example, the piece you heard, Images by Isang Yun, is from 1968, and it's responding to this white tiger fresco, which is about a 5th century tomb fresco that he is working to kind of translate into musical meaning and musical sounds. And so, right, there's this idea of translation that's at work when we think about music and sound, or composers or artists are working across their various media into, translating or thinking about relationships between different kinds of art forms. And, for me, this is a really wonderful opportunity because Haegue Yang has really kind of put this at the fore of her work as well. For many years now, she's been championing the work of Isang Yun and making his music part and parcel of her exhibitions. And so she's inviting this kind of relationship, inviting us really to think about how we might connect her music, I guess her music with his visual art, right? Or his music with her visual art. So that's kind of more or less what I'm going to try to do in the kind of brief time that I'll be speaking to you today, was opening up these kinds of questions about, how can we think of these two artists in relationship to one another? And so let me introduce each of them briefly. They both have very rich biographies that I am distilling to very bare facts right now. But Haegue Yang was born in 1971 in South Korea. She did her BFA at Seoul National University, received her MFA, and is now a professor at the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst in Frankfurt, Germany. She's had major exhibitions all over the world. For instance, she was a South Korean representative at the 2009 Venice Biennale. She works in multimedia art, frequently uses household objects such as Venetian blinds, as well as collages to produce objects whose aesthetic lies somewhere between minimalism, conceptualism, and abstraction. And as I said already, she's been promoting Yun's work for many, many years now. And you can see examples of kind of her three-dimensional works that these are somewhat emblematic of her style and the kinds of works that she's been doing, and which are quite distinct from the flat works downstairs, which hopefully you took a look at before you came in and will take a look at as you leave. Isang Yun was born in 1917, died in 1995, is a couple generations older than Yang, but has a kind of similar biography, right? Beginning his life in Korea and then moving westward, moving to Germany in particular, and making getting his education in more kind of Western forms of modernism. So he begins to study European romantic music in Tokyo and Seoul, moves first to Paris and then to Germany, and eventually settles in West Berlin in the 1950s. He finds immense success in operatic and chamber music genres with a transcultural aesthetic that translate East Asian musical ideas into European modernist musical forms. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that going forward. An interesting biographical detail that is quite resonant with some of Yang's work: he was abducted from West Berlin in 1967 by the South Korean CIA, suspected of espionage, sentenced to death following imprisonment. He was subsequently freed in 1968 after considerable outcry from the West and protests all around the world. So freed in 1968, then returns to West Berlin in 1971, where he then takes up German citizenship. Funny little anecdote that the CIA, this Korean CIA, tries to kidnap him again in like I think it was even latest, sometime in the 70s, but they fail. So there is, right, this kind of cloak and dagger espionage tale that we don't normally associate with modernist composers who write in 12-tone music, but here we are. Fascinating. So, like Yang, I am quite fascinated by Isang Yun after having had the chance to spend a couple months thinking about him. So, I want to kind of get back to this initial question, which is, how do we relate artists across media? And how I want to get into that question is basically by using Yang's method on herself and her relationship to Yun. So I want to think about this piece for a moment called Accommodating the Epic Dispersion on non-cathartic volume of Dispersions from 2012 here. And it's a large sculptural installation that was done in the house. I can just give you a little more details and have a different shot. So it was a large sculptural installation done at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. And as the art historian Lara Vergara says, this exemplifies her methodological approach to, do I have a, oh no, this still, oh, I do. So here we are. So exemplifies her methodological approach to history through abstract sculpture, a process often grounded in extensive research of historical events, which she arrives at through literature rather than conventional history writing. And so the chronology of biography you have of Dura and Yun that you received upon entry is an example of this. And so this earlier exhibition, Accommodating the Epic Dispersion, was a juxtaposition or kind of counterfactual history inspired by Korean-Japanese author Soo Kyung-sik and his writings on the Italian Auschwitz survivors driver Primo Levi. And she traces parallelisms between the Holocaust and the history of Korea since its annexation by Japan in 1910. And so what she tries to get at, right, obviously it's comparing these kinds of historical events and then abstracting them into something like a sculpture using Venetian blinds takes some creative shall we say, chutzpah, to understand kind of what's going on in here. But what I like about it is that she's precisely trying to extract or abstract from these biographical narratives, from their shared experience of, shall we say, captivity and imprisonment. She's trying to get a feeling out of that. So she's trying to kind of take something emotionally resonant from juxtaposing those two historical narratives and then building them into a kind of formalist sculpture. And what this says, right, this sculpture, as you can see here, there are people sort of putting themselves in relationship to the sculpture, finding themselves restrained or blocked by their movement around it. And so, right, she's taking this idea of restraint and captivity and kind of making that into a sculpture. But again, it's all working through this kind of historiographical method of counterfactual history or creative anachronism, et cetera, et cetera. And so this, to me, has become the method. I want to kind of subject Haegue Yang and Isang Yun to this kind of juxtaposition to see what we might abstract from that relationship, what kinds of feeling tones or ideas or modes of working we might see working between them. And so what I want to get at is something that really hit me strong here at the exhibition opening a few weeks ago, which was this idea of flatness as a kind of abstraction. And so in the terrific catalog essay by Oriana Cachon, Non-Parallel Dimensions, she writes here, as such, I'll start at the top of this slide here, and we'll not read the second paragraph. As such, the flat works are not flat at all. They are sites of compression, paradoxically revealing a depth of space. For Yang, flattening is a synonym for abstraction, and that comes from an interview with Yang. And this abstraction acts across dimensions to infiltrate and deconstruct ways of knowing in contemporary society. And of course, the way that she works, right, she oftentimes will take mail and kind of flatten it out and make it into collages, as you'll see in the Trustworthies downstairs. And so for me, right, this is a really interesting idea. Flattening is a synonym for abstraction. Compression is a kind of artistic practice that, right, involves a kind of holding together, right? Flattening something from 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, and then having that kind of tension that remains because you're trying to hold it down. And that I feel in a lot of these works. And you kind of see, these are works that are on view downstairs, but for example, the lacquer paintings are a good example of this. Otherwise, the non-foldings. And so she's, compressing 3-dimensional objects into 2 dimensions through layers of lacquer being sort of applied to different objects, such as that mesh bag, right? Making something 3-dimensional into kind of a flat 2-dimensional picture plane. And then these other objects, the non-foldings, which basically put 3-dimensional objects onto paper, then she spray paints over them to kind of create a kind of 2-dimensional rendering of them, right? So this idea of compression or this flattening out, taking a kind of 2-dimensional sounding of something that is otherwise 3-dimensional. So at the exhibition opening dinner, I had my aha moment. Compression is my metaphor for thinking about these ideas. And so I got to thinking, okay, well, if this is my animating metaphor, how do we think about compression and music and sound? So here's what I want to draw out from Isang Yun's work. We think about compression and technology, right? MP3s, streaming, audio has to be compressed and reduced and has a kind of uptick in its noisiness that's part of it. That's certainly a way that we can think about compression working across music that we're experiencing today through these kind of digital consumption. And it's not totally unrelated to how I'm thinking about Yun's work, but I want to think about 3 things here. One, the kind of information density of a musical performance, also noise oftentimes through volume, and dissonance through either 12-tone technique, which I will not explain that right now, just put a pin in that, or lots of clusters and dissonance, right? So that's one thing I want to look at. So 2 is compression of a melody to a single note. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that, so I won't give too many spoilers currently. And then 3, compression of traditions. And this, again, is something that is kind of a link between Yang and Yun that I'll come back to in concluding my conclusion with that. So let's kind of, and when I want to kind of take a look at a few pieces on tonight's program, so it's a preview of coming attractions a little bit. So first of all, this idea of compression as information density, noise, and dissonance. So Yun is working largely in a post-World War II European modernist musical vocabulary in which consonance and dissonance are both basically given equality now, and composers can use whatever they want, more or less whenever they want it. And so oftentimes there's an expansion of musical vocabularies and harmonies so that we're not necessarily that interested in, let's say, making pretty sounds. And so here we have this idea of information density, noise, and dissonance. This is a piece, Interludium A, that Mabel will play later on. Here's just the beginning of it. Let me show you some things. So we have this idea of density, right? Cluster tones, very loud cluster tones, which you can kind of see here, 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 here. And then other kinds of density as well, fast little filigree or figuration, this kind of twinkling music that is such a part of Yun's style. Oops, there's one more cluster, sorry. And then twinkling music, kind of very cool, lots of notes in a little bit of time. There as well, there as well, there as well. So just to kind of get an idea, right, we have compression of sound into noise and compression of lots of notes into a little bit of time. And we'll listen to just a bit of that. Oh, there's one more. So there's a bit of that. You'll hear the rest momentarily. So second type of compression that I'm thinking about, compression is abstraction, compression is kind of flattening out. And here it's compression of melody to a single note. And if there's a kind of compositional technique that Yun sort of is known for, it's this idea, what in German is called the Haupttontechnik, or what you can just call in English the main tone technique. And so Yun describes this like this. He says, one can liken our tones to brush strokes. Side note, interesting, right? Visual art comparison there already. So one can liken our tones to brushstrokes in contrast to the line of a drawing pencil. From beginning to end, each tone is submitted to transformations. It is embellished with ornaments, appoggiaturas, trills, glissandi, and dynamic modifications. Above all, the natural vibration of each tone as deliberately employed as a means of design. The modifications of a tone or in pitch are regarded not so much as melody-forming intervals, rather in their ornamental function and as parts of the expressive register, they are understood as one and the same tone. And so I want to just zoom in on that, right? This idea of the natural vibration of each tone is deliberately employed as a means of design. There we have a kind of idea that I was referencing earlier, right? With Yang's work, we're compressing from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions, and there's this kind of residual vibration that's happening between those 2 dimensions as they're compressed. Here, Yun is sort of finding that kind of tension or vibration within an individual note, right? An individual note has its own kind of energy that is vibrating within it, and this is a kind of interesting philosophical idea that I won't necessarily go into, but it's something that he makes a whole compositional style of, and it's very much indebted to his experience with East Asian, Korean, Japanese courtly music. And I'll talk about that in a second. But here's a bit of what that sounds like, right? In these kinds of, here's a piece from 1971 called Namo, just after he's returned from South Korea back to West Berlin. And it sets Buddhist prayer texts. And it's terrifying. And you can see sort of the way in which these 3 sopranos are kind of focused on kind of one particular note. They sort of like pull away from it and kind of come back to it. So here's a bit of it. Oh, whoops, sorry. There we go. Right? So there's a lot of ooh kind of throughout the whole thing. And they're like, oh, kind of like doing all this kind of fun stuff around it and kind of coming back to that note. And so as I was saying, right, this is something that Yun is hearing in Korean courtly music traditions, other kinds of Korean music traditions as well. For instance, we can hear this kind of recitational style in pansori singing, which is a very storied, important Korean art form. But listen for the same kind of recitational idea. You can hear it in this performance as she kind of focuses on one particular pitch and comes around.
친의 목을 안고 아이고 아버지 진봉사 깜짝 놀래 헤이 아버지라니 누구요?
So that same idea, right? That we're kind of centered on this note and kind of coming around it, kind of coming away, coming back, well, coming away, coming back, etc. But this is where he's getting this idea of the main tone technique, right? And he's using this to organize his music. And we'll hear a great example of this in the piece Espace from 1992, a very late work by Yun, just 3 years before his death, that Mabel and Chris will play later on. But you can see here the way in which this is being developed in a kind of Western 12-tone, dissonant modernist style, right? We have a lot of focus here. There's an F sharp that's kind of, played a lot of and kind of inflected chromatically and with kind of coming away from it, coming back. Another example there, right? The F sharp continues on with kind of various appoggiaturas and ornamentations. It continues there again. And then finally we move away from it and go to an A natural as our next kind of main tone, and that's kind of what he's doing. He's kind of shaping sections of the piece by these kinds of main tones that are kind of guiding it. And what I like about this musical technique is that it's actually quite audible, whereas like a lot of 12-tone technique stuff, you don't know what's going on. This is quite, I think, audible to us, and here's an example of it. There's a bit of that. So the final form of compression I want to think about is this idea of compression of traditions, that is writing East Asian music through Western systems and instruments. And you can see here a really terrific piece that Chris will play later on called Glissé for solo cello, and that exemplifies this, I think, in really compelling ways. This is from 1970, so it's again a sort of earlier work than Espace, which is several years later. But what you can notice here, right, he's, again, like with the pansori singing or the main tone singing, right, he's taking an idea, right, a concept really, or a kind of approach to musical material, and then moving it into a Western context, moving it into a compositional context of late 20th century, late post-war modernism. And so here's a way that I think that's going on, right? This kind of compression, right, means that he's taking up ideas, moving them from one and kind of applying them to another. I mean, I'm maybe taking the compression metaphor a little bit far here, but it's still, I kind of, because I like this idea of the tension between different kinds of dimensions, right? 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions. We can feel that kind of tension between the kind of application of a Western tradition onto, or Eastern tradition onto a Western tradition. So let's take an example from this Korean zither from the gugak family, and let's look at a few things that are drawn upon for the piece Glissé, the solo cello piece. And so what we can see here is the performer, Jang Se-yu, is playing with a plectrum, so she has a little stick that she's playing the zither with, and then she's also bending the pitch as well, so creating pitch bends and pitch instability with her other hand. And we can just take a listen to a bit of that. And so, two ideas, right? Pluck strings, sliding tones. And we see those again here in Lycée, the third movement, where these chords are plucked with a guitar pick, here, 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 here. And then sliding tones are performed by the other hand as well. You can see a number of sliding tones as well. Kind of throughout, I didn't quite catch them all, like Pokemon, but here, that was a dumb joke, sorry. And we can hear a little bit of it here now. So I become really interested in sort of how Yun describes this process. Like, how does he talk about his, personal compositional identity and its cultural position? So he says here, right, my music can be heard as Eastern or Western. That tells you my situation exactly. I'm not a typical East Asian, nor am I Europeanized. I had to struggle to gain an understanding of Western music, and afterwards I had to remember that I was from Asia. For the first time, I was able to study to express that which is Eastern in myself, that which is flowing in the language of Western music. But instead of it letting it flow, I intend to build, to make a structure in such a way that it is exactly what I want to say in the musical language, which is totally my own, original. You know, though, that I do not have any interest in the question of whether I compose Western or Eastern music. I write the music that I have to write because I am just myself. Surely the musicologists can busy themselves with making long analyses. Apologies to Mr. Yun. But this kind of gets at what I'm talking about, right? When you have this kind of interesting compression of traditions, something new is going to come about. Something new is going to be generated. And right, as with many modernists, like Haegue Yang, like Stefan Volpe, like Igor Stravinsky, like any number of artists who are these kind of migrant moderns, right? They develop out of their own personal experiences of their home culture as well as other cultures as well, a totally new, kind of singular, unique artistic voice. And that's, I think, what Yun is trying to describe here, to explain here. So we don't really need to worry too much about, like, is he Eastern, is he Western, where does he fit? I mean, those are, and become very fruitless conversations after a while, because they lead to, a lot of the times, kind of base essentialism as well. And I don't want to do that either to Yun or to Yang. So, but I am interested in this idea, right, of compressing one tradition onto another. And I was, just by way of conclusion, because I need to wrap things up so we can get to the real show, I wanted to kind of think about, well, can we see this kind of compression at work in the show downstairs? How is Yang maybe exploring this idea of working with traditions or mapping traditions onto one another? And so I, got interested in the Mesmerizing Mesh series, which is what you see as you first enter the gallery. These amazing paper cutouts that are drawing on all these different styles and traditions of paper cutting, from Korea, Slavic, Mexican, Chinese, Jewish, right? All these different styles are being sort of kind of put in kind of dialogue and contrast with one another and worked through and developed. So for me, right, it seems that Yang herself is kind of taking up this idea, right, taking up different kinds of cultural traditions and working them through her own unique artistic voice as well. So with that, I want to kind of just say that I've hoped to kind of give you some ways into the music tonight, some ways into kind of looking at the art downstairs, and we can get on with the music. So thank you very much.